This Saturday will be 2 weeks until we vote on The Voice. Latest polling suggests support has plummeted, with the No campaign on track to win in a landslide. But many Australians are still undecided and confused about what The Voice actually means, how it would work. So, we've invited constitutional legal expert Dr. Gabrielle Appleby in to answer your questions, and yes, there are plenty of them. Gabrielle, thanks for joining us. We'll begin with Andrew, who asks, how will a voice to Parliament help Indigenous people gain an extra 8 years of life to improve their health, give better schooling and housing, and allow them to speak their traditional language? What do you say to Andrew?
Yeah, look, we know that the call in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, in which the call for a First Nations voice was made, was really driven by the need to deliver practical outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in relation to these issues around health, education, and what we generally speak to as the need to close the gap in relation to a lot of these outcomes. We know from research, from academic research, but we also know from countless government reports, the most recent being a report of the Productivity Commission, that if you speak to and work with communities, Indigenous communities, on issues that are affecting them, you get much better outcomes. And that is the whole proposition of The Voice, that you are going to have a guaranteed, stable institution to do that speaking to and working with the government to develop better policies that are going to deliver better outcomes in all of these areas.
All right. Now, Sharon asks if we know what percentage of First Australians will actually be voting yes.
So we have a lot of polling that it's telling us that there is very strong support within the First Nations community in Australia, and those polls vary from 80% to the mid-80% of support. And of course we know that the actual process that delivered the Uluru Statement that calls for this reform involved more than 1,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country, engaged in very deep reflective discussions about what form of constitutional recognition they were seeking.
But like the broader community, it's not a single voice, there are different points of view.
Well, absolutely. And what we know from those discussions that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart is they were not a hand-select group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They had lots of diverse views, lots of diverse experiences. They were drawn from all over the country. But then The Voice itself is going to have to grapple with the need to represent diverse views as well.
All right, let's get to some of the video questions, and this from Judy Barker from Western Australia.
What will the Indigenous people get if they win the yes vote that they are not getting now to better their way of life?
All right, what do you say to Judy?
So what we know from the regional dialogue process is that First Nations communities from across the breadth of the country feel the absence of a stable representative body that can take their issues to Parliament and to the government.
Lots of questions about the Voice to Parliament through the advisory group and what it would look like if the Yes campaign does get up. Alan asks, how big will the Voice be in number, and will members of the Voice be paid, and if so, how much? And Philip's question is more about the panel itself, wanting to know whether or not the advisory group, how it will be decided, by vote or by some other method, and how long will any one person be allowed to stay on this advisory group. What will it actually look like, this advisory group, or is that the detail that will be decided later?
So it's a really important question. The question that we are being asked as Australians on the 14th of October is whether we agree to the constitutional establishment and protection of the body itself, the Voice, and its constitutional function of advising the government and the Parliament. Now, the question of exactly how many members will make up the Voice, how they will be selected from across Australia, questions around remuneration but also resourcing for the body, they're all questions that will be decided should there be a yes vote through legislation, and that will have to go through the ordinary legislative process, public process, subject to deliberation and voting in Parliament.
Many viewers, though, feel that a voice is unnecessary because Indigenous Australians are already representative in Parliament. There are 11 elected representatives. Here's a question from Alan Chandler.
Why is the government reinventing the wheel when there's already 109 Aboriginal agencies giving advice on matters representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders?
Are there that many agencies already? Is that correct?
So there are already a number of Indigenous members of Parliament in both houses. There's, of course, a department which deals with Indigenous affairs, the National Indigenous Australians agencies, and there are many agencies, some of which have statutory basis and some of which are non-government agencies that work in Indigenous affairs. But it's very different from a proposition of a body that is selected by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to represent them and present their views to the government.
All right. Now, there is some great involvement from younger viewers as well engaged in this debate, which is great to see. Here are questions from friends Nao and Michelle.
How do you think this proposal to voice to Parliament will be leading steps to bringing Indigenous people back into the conversation of Australian constitutional law?
Do you think that the lack of clarity as to the impact and influence the voice to Parliament will have has created a divide that, if the alterations to the Constitution were to fail, could potentially set First Nations people back from ever being recognised in the Constitution?
So this, the proposal to create a new body within the Constitution will be the first time that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our Constitution have been positively recognised. So that's a really important change in terms of the constitutional inclusion for First Nations people. In relation to the second question, where do we go if there is a no vote from here, and does it take constitutional recognition off the table? Look, I think this is, even if it's a yes vote, part of an ongoing conversation. If there is a no vote, I don't think that we'll never have a conversation about constitutional recognition again. It is such an important part of our history, of our ongoing identity as a nation. And of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are such a vibrant, important part of our community. There will be a future conversation.
Do you think it'll get up?
I hope so.
All right. Gabrielle, thank you for your time. Hopefully it's cleared up some of the confusion, because there is quite a bit of it from a lot of the Australian public to this day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.